All right, we are continuing today our series called 66 Books in 52 Weeks, and we are up to the book of Ruth in the Old Testament, and we're going to go through this book tonight. This is an interesting, kind of a unique book. I think you'll enjoy this. This is one of my favorite ones. It's a smaller book. It's only 4 chapters, but I think you'll enjoy this. I know it's one of my favorites. So let's just look at some of the overview of Ruth here, and I'll zoom this in for you all that are watching online here. So the overview there is it's the 8th book of the Old Testament, and so it was most likely written by the prophet Samuel, and we'll learn about Samuel next week as we start into 1st and to 2nd Samuel. It tells the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman who ends up over in Israel. We'll get through that. I don't want to have too many spoiler alerts here, but and so the structure of the book is kind of simple here. This is according to those outlines that are available that are printed out. You can pick these up here at the church. The structure, you have Ruth chapter 1 is the background of Ruth. Number 2 is Ruth meets Boaz, and then number 3, Ruth carries out a strange plan. And number 4, this is the spoiler alert here in the story. Boaz marries Ruth. So that's the structure of it, but there are some great insights and some great things that we can gain from this. The key verse in this is one that you probably have heard quoted time and again, maybe even read at weddings, different occasions like that. And the key verse is, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." And that is Ruth speaking to her mother-in-law, Naomi. So we'll get through all the context of that. So as we before we get into this, now I heard this story. It was accredited that this happened in Benjamin Franklin's lifetime, and the story goes like this: that when Benjamin Franklin was serving as an ambassador to France, he occasionally attended this book club, or this club where they would read literary masterpieces and talk about them. And on one occasion, history says, or legends puts it, that Benjamin Franklin read the book of Ruth to the club. But instead of using the names that were there, he changed the names in it so it would not be recognized as a book of the Bible. And when he finished, the listeners were unanimous in their praise. They said it was one of the most beautiful love stories, short stories that they'd ever heard, and they demanded that he tell them where they had run across such a remarkable work of art, and he loved to tell them that it came from the Bible. So I heard that story about Benjamin Franklin. I don't know if it's true or not. If it's not, it ought to be. So anyway, I like that. But I've heard that for years, and but this is a love story. Now, the Bible, as we've seen, is an amazing book, and it's marked by a great variety in there. We got 66 books. Not all the books are the same. You have books that contain all kinds of symbolism in them. There's apocalyptic writing, such as the book of Revelation. You have books of poetry, such as the Psalms and book of Job and Ecclesiastes. You have books of history, this would be a history book in a sense. You have genealogies that are listed out, and you even have a love story. And that's what this is right here, a love story. But it's much deeper than a love story, because it's a love story that symbolizes and points to the greatest love story of all time. And so we'll take a look at this as we go through. So now, as we make our way into this, there are some terms that we need to review. Some of these you might already know, especially if you listened to last week's lesson. The first term would be, some terms to know would be judges. Okay, so who were the judges? We talked about this last week in detail. The events of the book of Ruth take place during the time of the judges. And as we talked about last week, this was a very dark period in the history of Israel, and it was marked by God's people being very disobedient. As a matter of fact, to the point where they did some pretty, I just say some messed up stuff took place in the book of Judges. Just some horrible sins, just some crazy things. As you go through it and you read it, sometimes my jaw would just drop and think, I can't believe that's in there, even though I've read it and I go back to it again. And the key verse of the book of Judges is really the last verse in that book. Judges 21:25 says, in those days Israel had no king, everyone did as he saw fit. And so they just did what they wanted to do. And so different judges ruled Israel during this time. We talked about probably two of the most famous judges that most people would know, even people that maybe haven't even read the Bible, might be familiar with the names Gideon and Samson. Samson was the strong man who had a weak character. Then you have Gideon, and it is thought that the events of Ruth took place during the time that Gideon was judge over Israel. It was during that time. So you have the time of the judges. Then you have another term, and that would be the term Moab. So Moab, the people of Moab were pagans who made it clear over the centuries that they had little love for the people of God. They were enemies of Israel. So now just going over here, I'm going to take the mouse over here to where I'm going to take my mouse over here so you can kind of see where we are here. So this is Moab, and this is Bethlehem. We'll look at that in just a moment here. But so if you remember, the Israelites were in this part they were in the wilderness. They had come from this part, and in the time of Joshua, they crossed over the Jordan River, made their way into the Promised Land. They conquered this land over here. There were some few tribes. There's 3 tribes that were on this side of the river, and but over here is where the Moabites resided, and this was a pagan nation. And the people of that nation, the people of Israel, were not to intermarry or to have contact with the people in that pagan nation because they would turn their hearts away from God. And so they were not to seek a treaty, friendship with the Moabites. I'll read back from Deuteronomy 23. Here is the command. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord even down to the 10th generation. Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3. And so those who the Moabites are, and so to travel to Moabite would be to camp out in the middle of a forbidden place. So this was in the time of the judges. People were doing just as they saw fit anyway, but this is the time that it was. So now that brings us to another thing, and this might not be on your printout there, but this is another thing we need to remember is Bethlehem. And we saw on the map that part of this takes place in Bethlehem. And the word Bethlehem. Now we know Bethlehem for what? Of course, that's where Jesus was born. But it takes place, it factors into this Old Testament story as well. And the word Bethlehem means house of bread. So the name of that town means house of bread. And so the story of Ruth begins and ends in Bethlehem, the house of bread, as it's called. So that brings us to the next term here, the term gleaning. So this was a special provision. They didn't have, like we have, safety nets and welfare, different things, safety nets to help people out that maybe are going through difficult times. This was a provision that God put in place in the Old Testament to help those who were poor or destitute or who needed help. And so this was the idea of gleaning. And so I'm going to read from Leviticus 19, 9 and 10 to show where this was commanded here. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. And so this was a way of taking care of those who needed help, that didn't have any way to grow food on their own. And so, but also, interesting too, they had to put in their own effort as well. They would go along, they could glean and get their food, bring it back, and provide for family as they could. Now, the next one is very much key to this book, also to understanding how this fits in. You can see you can find Jesus in every one of these books in some way. So this idea of the kinsman redeemer. Now, this is alien to our culture here. So when the Israelites entered the promised land, God assigned not only the tribes. We've seen those 12 tribes all lined up on that map where the different tribes were. But not only did God assign each tribe, he assigned each family of each tribe a different section of land. And so the kinsman redeemer law was instituted to make sure that land would stay within the families, within each of the tribes of Israel here. So here's how it worked. Now this is going to be foreign to our way of thinking, but if a man died and left a widow and no sons, his nearest relative would be given the opportunity to buy his land and marry his widow so that she could have sons and carry on the deceased name. So this was the way it worked. If he agreed, this relative will be obligated at his own expense to buy back the property and give it back to the relative who had sold it. Now, if the nearest relative refused to go through with the kinsman redeemer thing, then the next closest kin would take on the role of the kinsman redeemer. And this is how it went. If no one chose to marry the widow, then she would likely live out the rest of her days in poverty. Now, there was a catch. This all ties into this. There was a catch. The kinsman redeemer had to be asked by the widow to buy back the husband's land. She had to take the initiative to go to the kinsman redeemer and ask to buy back the land. So let me just read to you where this comes from, Deuteronomy 25:5, where the law is written out here. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. This was part of their culture and how it had been lined out here. Leviticus 25:25. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. And so this is the kinsman redeemer. I have to kind of look at it in print again just to kind of get it in my head exactly how this works again. But this plays into all of this here. So another term here, and this is not as complicated. Another term here is the corner of covering. In short, that's just a marriage proposal. Today, if you're going to propose to somebody, you go out and you buy a ring, you get on one knee, you open up the ring, the box, and hopefully she says, I do, and that's kind of how that works. Well, this was a marriage proposal, how that worked. And then the final thing is this, sandals. Why would this be in there? All right, we'll find this out as we get into there. The giving of a sandal was like signing a contract in that day. So we sign a paper, and that makes a contract official. There was an exchange of sandals. This is kind of how this went, and it showed that an agreement was official, and that's how this worked here. So, yeah, well, no, Marlene said, "Is that where they tie shoes to the car?" Well, that came back a little bit later in history, but so this was what that was. So you can see these terms that are here, and if you understand these, you understand the things that are taking place in the book of Ruth just a little bit better. So that brings us now to the story. So as you go through this, I call this the Hallmark movie of the Bible. So, if you ever watch those Hallmark movies, where there's this love story and the couple ends up happily ever after at the end. This unlikely couple comes together, they end up married. And so, however, this has eternal significance and biblical significance as well. So I don't want to be disrespectful to the book of Ruth, but it kind of reminds me of that sometimes here. So the story is this. We're going to go, chapter 1 is this: to Moab and back. All right, so we're going to read here. I'm going to read Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the days when the judges ruled, and there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrathites from Bethlehem, Judea, and they went to Moab and lived there. So, again, let's just talk about what's happened here. You got a family that's from Bethlehem. A famine hits the land, likely during the time of Gideon. They make their way over to Moab, which is the forbidden land, and that's where they settle at that time. So this is chapter 1 to Moab and back again. We're making our way through here. So we begin with the family, Elimelech and Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They're living in Bethlehem. Again, what does Bethlehem mean? The house of bread. But, ironically, there is no bread in the house of bread. So Elimelech moves his family to Moab. Again, this was not a good move. This would have been against God's law for a family to take up residence in a pagan land. Certainly, nothing but trouble would await them. And guess what? Trouble found them. I'm going to read here verses 3 through 5 of Ruth chapter 1. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. I'd call that trouble. And she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. Now they shouldn't have done that according to God's command. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So in that day, all a widow had to look forward to was a life in poverty. She had no way, no male heirs or way. So she was in a bad spot. So here is Naomi. Her husband is gone. Her sons are gone. No means of support. And so then the word comes that the famine is finally over in Bethlehem. And so the house of bread, that again. So she makes the decision to return from Moab back to her own people. And so her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, begin to follow her back from Moab, out of their homeland, back to Bethlehem, the house of bread. And then Naomi, she pleads with them, go back to your own people. Go back to the Moabites there. If they followed her to Bethlehem, they would not likely find another husband. And because they're Moabites, they would likely be treated as outcasts. They would likely live the rest of their days in poverty. And then the Israelites, again, they hated the Moabites. And these girls would likely be hated for the rest of their lives. And so Naomi's trying to be compassionate and say, go back, just go back to your own people. So Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and went back to her own people at Naomi's request. But Ruth, she clung to Naomi. And once again, Naomi, please go back with your sister-in-law. And now here's Ruth's response, and this is where you get that famous passage. Ruth 1:16 through 18. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. And then when Naomi realized that Ruth was very much determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two of them, they traveled. They went from Bethlehem to Moab and back down to Bethlehem. So here's Naomi with Ruth. Both of them are widowed, and they're making their way back to Bethlehem just as the harvest was beginning. So now that brings us to chapter 2 of the Bible's version of a Hallmark movie.
Dave,
Yes.
you preached that September 26th, 2010.
Exactly right. I did. Very much so. And this is one of my favorite ones here to go through here. And if you couldn't hear that online there, it was mentioned that I had gone through this back a little over 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, and gone through this. But I really, really enjoy this book there. So now we're up to chapter 2, and chapter 2, we'll call that Who's That Girl? All right? So again, Hallmark movie here. You can kind of feel the vibe of that there. This chapter begins by mentioning that Naomi had a relative on her husband's side by the name of Boaz. The Bible says that he was a man of standing. All right, so he's a person of interest here. And since it was harvest time, Ruth volunteers to go into the field to pick up the leftover grain so that she and Naomi could have something to eat. Ruth goes out and ends up gleaning from a field belonging to Boaz. Here's the gleaning part there. So Boaz was a relative of Naomi, who was the man of good standing. And sometime during the day, Boaz arrives at his field where Ruth is going around gleaning, and he notices Ruth. And he asks one of the reapers there, "Whose young woman is that?" So you can tell he's kind of interested. She catches his eye. I like the way the King James Bible translates it. The King James says, "Whose damsel is that?" I remember it was very much like the first time I met my wife, Linda. I thought to myself, what a lovely damsel. And so I went to talk to her, and now 30-some years later, we're still married here. And so from the start, it's obvious that Boaz is very interested in Ruth, and he goes to her as she is gleaning in the field. And so in Ruth 2, verses 8 and 9, so Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and wherever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So Ruth is wondering, why is this man being so kind to me? What had she done to find such favor in his eyes? Boaz said that he had heard about the kind way that she had treated her mother-in-law, Naomi. So word had gotten around what Ruth had done there. So when mealtime came, in essence, Boaz asked Ruth to lunch. Boaz saw to it that Ruth was protected as she gleaned around the field, and he also made sure that the workers, quote-unquote, accidentally dropped extra grain along her path so she could get even more food. And so that evening, Ruth goes back home, and she has got a big haul of food with her. And Naomi could not believe how much grain that Ruth had brought back. And Ruth explained all about Boaz and what had happened. And here's what Naomi said, Ruth 2:20. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He's one of our kinsman redeemers." So there you go back to that phrase there. So now that brings us to chapter 3. What do you think is going to happen next? Matchmaker. All right, so chapter 3. Some time goes by. Naomi senses that there is a chemistry between Boaz and Ruth. And understanding the law of the kinsman redeemer, Naomi tells Ruth what to do. Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself, and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." This is just quite a dating thing here, isn't it? So, this was a public space here, that where he's been. So it would have been a public area here, so there's no immorality or anything like that going on here. But look down in Ruth 3, verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." That was the marriage proposal. Spread the corner. So there it is, right there. So Boaz was happy about this. He was overjoyed. He was in love. He desired very much to marry Ruth. But just like any good movie, again, these are real events, so I'm just kind of having fun with this. Just like any good movie, there's always a little bit of a plot twist there. It's something that seems that everything's going to fall apart, or maybe it's not going to work. So they realized that there is another kinsman redeemer who was more closely related to Ruth than Boaz would have been. So Boaz is now going to have to seek this other relative's permission before he could marry Ruth. So now you have this plot. Is it going to work out? And just like any other good Hallmark movie, is he going to chase her down at the airport saying, "Wait, I love you"? It's not going to happen like that. So anyway, we've got matchmaker, and then chapter 4, here comes the bride. All right. So Boaz goes to the city gate where official business took place in that day. And in the presence of 10 city elders, he spoke to the other kinsman redeemer about the land that formerly belonged to Elimelech. Boaz said, "Hey, you can buy this land, but it would involve marrying Ruth from Moab." At that, the idea of having to marry somebody, the other kinsman redeemer lost his interest in the land. So problem solved there for Boaz. So, and this is where the sandal comes in, Ruth chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. "Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, 'Buy it for yourself.' And he removed his sandal." He was not interested in marriage, apparently. So he said, "Boaz, you can have the land. Buy it for yourself." So now the way is made clear, and now Ruth and Boaz are married. And that brings us down to Ruth chapter 4 and verse 13. "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son." So it's kind of it's one of those things, like you read these strange customs, it's kind of a fun book to read, but it brings along the narrative of God's redemption plan. It pushes it along in a very unique way. So we'll move to the next thing here, which would be from Ruth to Jesus. So what's the connection to the Lord? That child that Ruth had was named Obed. Obed was the father of a man by the name of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David, who became king of Israel. So we have here the idea that we're making our way to Jesus. Jesus would come from the family line of Jesus. So let me just read to you here from from here. It says Hezron, the father of Ram, Ram the father of Abinadab, Abinadab the father of Nashon, Nashon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David. Going through one of the genealogies there. And in Matthew 1:15, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. So you can see here as you're making your way down through the genealogy, you're making your way to David. When you get to David, you eventually follow the genealogy down, and it comes to Jesus. Isn't it interesting here? You have in the genealogy of Jesus himself, two women. Rahab was a prostitute from Jericho. Ruth was a pagan from Moab. But God, in his redemption plan, brought them along, and they ended up in the genealogy of Jesus. Both were rescued from their own lands. Both were brought into the fold of the people of God. Both are named in the genealogy of Jesus. I just think that's a remarkable thing to see that coming all the way through there. So now, we're not going to go quite as long here tonight but there are some lessons that we can gain from this. And if you want to fill this in on your papers there, I think there's some things we can fill in here. What are the lessons that we learn or applications that we make? The first application would be this: leave the pagan land. Leave the pagan land. So the story begins with the two daughters-in-law. You have Orpah and you have Ruth. Orpah stayed in Moab, went back to her own people. Ruth traveled to the house of bread. In that pagan land, there were all kinds of terrible things going on. In Moab, there was idol worship that involved all kinds of wicked practices, immorality. It wasn't just the fact that they built idols. It was the horrible, wicked, detestable practices that went along with that. That was all part of Moab. Ruth chose to leave the pagan land. Orpah chose to stay. God calls us to go out of the pagan land at some point in our walk with God. The land of greed, the land of promiscuity, the land of gossip, the land of addiction, the land of bitterness. Leave that land and to go to the house of bread. Jesus himself said he would be the bread of life. You don't have to stay in that pagan land. You can come to the house of bread. The next application we can make here is simply surrender to God. So when Ruth decided to go with Naomi to Bethlehem, she totally surrendered herself to the idea. She didn't say, hey, you know what, why don't I just go over there and try it out for a little while and see how it works, and if I don't like it, I'll just come on back to Moab. No, she said, where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. I'm making this decision of my own free will to follow you. Where you stay, I'll stay. I accept the consequences of my decision. I understand that following you could mean poverty and rejection, but I'm going to do that. Your people will be my people. I'm turning away from my people. I'm going to identify myself with God's people. Your God will be my God. I'm no longer going to worship the gods of Moab. I'm going to turn to the one true God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. My hope will be placed in the new land to which I am going. And then she goes, may the Lord deal with me ever so severely if nothing but death separates you and me. I make this decision once and for all. Ruth drew a line in the sand. And so what we can see here, we had a picture of what it means to come to Christ. When somebody accepts Christ as Savior, they draw that line in the sand. I'm following you, Lord, of my own free will. I accept the consequences of following you. I understand that sometimes following Christ might mean drinking the cup of suffering. I'm identifying myself with the people of God. I will be a Christian. I will no longer worship any gods but you. My hope is placed in your kingdom, and I make this decision once and for all. So you see this here, what Ruth is doing, coming out of the pagan land, surrendering to God. And then the next point here, if you're looking to follow along here, would be cultivate your character. Now, this really is the story of two godly women. You have Naomi and Ruth. While in Moab, Naomi must have had some kind of good influence on Ruth. There was some reason that Ruth wanted to follow her mother-in-law. You know, you hear all these mother-in-law jokes. Ruth didn't tell the mother-in-law. She laid down her life to follow her. She must have had some kind of a good influence on her. Ruth was faithful, and her good reputation became known all around Israel, around Bethlehem and those areas. She was influenced in a godly way, and then she, in turn, influenced others in a godly way. And so we have a lesson about cultivating your character and the influence that can have. And then finally here, I think this is the biggest application if you're talking about connecting this to Christ. It's receive the Redeemer. In this story, it is obvious that Boaz wanted to take Ruth to be his own. He wanted her to be the bride. But because of the kinsman redeemer law, he had to wait for Ruth to take the initiative. She had to accept the Redeemer. Jesus says this, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." In other words, he's standing there and waiting. We have to open the door. Jesus desires to make us his own. We're all, as Christians, as the church, we're known as the bride of Christ. Jesus desires to make us his own, but we, just like in this kinsman redeemer thing, we have to take that first step. We need to accept the Redeemer. And so there you have a very interesting account, a very interesting story with some strange customs to us. However, I think you can see how this so beautifully fits into the narrative of the gospel, the narrative of God's redemption plans.